Welcome to a new episode of The Speaking Citizen. I am your host, Mehru Jaffer. My guest today is a contemporary poet, the award-winning author Arundhathi Subramaniam. I have not read anything by Arundhathi, but thanks to the introduction by the Jaipur Literature Festival, now I surely will. I want to read Arundhati also because the titles of many of her books are so unusual, like Love Without a Story, Women Who Wear Only Themselves, and Eating God. We will talk about those titles in a bit. First, let me begin by saying how after the two world wars, Arundhati, the decolonization of a large part of the planet and the birth of very well-meaning organizations like the United Nations, the whole world had shared a dream of a more violence and war-free and just world in the future. What do you think happened to that dream? My first question to you is, from the point of view of a poet, what do you think has happened to that promise of never again such violence and hatred?
Thanks, Mehru. I'm glad to be here. And to talk of dreams is something that's kind of grist to every poet's mill, because essentially, however cliched that might seem, dreams are really what make poetry. So if one stops dreaming, there would be no poetry. And sometimes one thinks that's not such a bad thing. Sometimes one wonders whether the world wants poetry at all. But as a reader, as a lover of verse, I know I return to poetry because I want to remind myself that the world still dreams, and that dreams are not far-fetched fantasies and chimeras that we create for ourselves just when we are, sitting around and wanting to be dreamy-eyed and idealistic. Dreams for me are really ways of living and ways of actualizing vision. And to me, a poem is one of the first steps towards actualizing a vision, because you are releasing dream into word, and you are releasing it in the most distilled verbal utterance possible. So, of course, there are times when the world and all its shattered dreams can drive one mute, can make one silent, very, very silent. That's happened to me. I've had long spells of silence in my life, but I have returned to words out of urgency, out of necessity, and I return to poetry particularly because in a world clogged with meaning, and this is particularly true in a world of information overload, where there are words around us all the time, particularly in a world clogged with meaning, poetry becomes the art of a very compressed, condensed, molten utterance. It is only what needs to be said and nothing more at that moment for the poet. And hopefully that's how it is received by the reader in the right frame of mind.
That's beautiful. So, would you like to recite some words by you that best mirror the world we live in today? Unmute.
That's a tough one, Mehru. So it feels like many of the poems in some way are only a response to the world we live in today. I wish I could respond to a world that happened another time. Doesn't seem to work that way. But let me just read this poem because that's the one I've opened to. And I want to read you a short poem because we are having a short conversation. There are much longer poems about belonging and unbelonging, longer poems about the quest for the sacred. But I'm going to read you a very short poem called Memo, which is just a memo to myself. To choose the right table, the right quarrel, the right gaze. Not the conference of hungry eyes, but the fellowship of those who stand aslant, multilingual, listening, their shadows four-footed, their wisdom angostura, their hearts green sun and groundwater, those who hope to cut through the fog, uncurdle the dream, but still weep unoriginally for the moon.
How do you weep unoriginally?
How do I what unoriginally?
How do you weep unoriginally? To quote
The
your
thing is, for every person, there is really such a heritage of those who have wept for the moon, Mehru. That's really what's made this world the great soggy place that it is, and the great wandering place that it is. I find increasingly I'm as capable as the next person of having an opinion, of having strong views, of taking strong positions. But I find myself increasingly drawn to the tribe of those who weep, and they're not the first to weep, and therefore unoriginally, for the moon. I find myself increasingly drawn to those who have the courage to admit that they are sometimes just bewildered.
So, in a nutshell, we live in a world that is most bewildering. Very, very interesting. Also, very interested to know why do you say women, why do you talk of women who wear nothing but themselves? What does it mean?
That was an interesting book to do, Mehru. I worked on it during the pandemic, and it was a book that kind of inserted itself into my life. I felt ambushed by it in a way, because these were conversations I'd had with women over almost 10 years. And they're women who, they're women who excited me because they were very different. They were women on sacred journeys of their own, and women of very different temperaments. As I sat down that day, I remember the day it started, I sat down one day and said, what on earth, how does one make sense of this very, very strange time we're in? And what am I thirsting for? And I realized what I was thirsting for was to listen to how other people make sense of their lives. But I found that there was a particular thirst to hear the voices of women, because those are the voices that, as we all know, whether it's in cultural or literary canons, that are drowned out, and it's no different in spiritual literature as well. We either hear of women as decorative calendar art saints, or else they're excluded altogether. So I wanted to talk to contemporary women, for contemporary women, who find their way of being themselves today. And I found, as I explored these four portraits, that these were women who wore their spirituality differently, but they also wear themselves differently, and they wear their very attire differently. So there's one who chooses to give up a monk's robes and wear blue jeans. There is one who chooses to embrace the monastic path. And there is one who throws off all her clothes altogether and lives naked. To me, this in many ways encapsulated the many ways in which women are learning to wear themselves today.
Beautiful. So, and how do we eat God?
That is a wonderful question. And that is actually a particularly good question, because I have a feeling when I proposed that title to my publisher, they were not terribly happy. They wanted a slightly more lyrical and romantic title for a book of bhakti poetry, which is what that is. It's an anthology of bhakti poems from all over the subcontinent. And they said, eating God, why not pining or longing or yearning? And I was very clear that I didn't want that kind of word, because it can so easily lend itself to this idea of syrupy devotion. And if there's anything that these bhakti poets are not, it is syrupy. They're wild, and they're crazy, and they're audacious, and they're irreverent, and they're argumentative, and they're erotic. This is about a spirited relationship with God. It's about being fully human. So I wanted to implicate the idea of bhakti as a deep, tearing hunger for the divine. And I'm not the one to do that. The poets do it. So whether you're reading Kabir or Nammalvar or Janabai, they talk of eating God in their own very singular way.
Eating themselves on God. And that brings us to the third, also very interesting title. You talk of love that has no story. So what kind of a love is it that has no story?
Well, I always thought of love stories, of course. So I think we all do. And life is full of wonderful stories, and there are great fiction writers recording them. For me, poetry has always been, in some ways, a form that allows you to be untethered, unmoored from a story. And I've always seen poetry that way. It's almost a refuge from the story, from narrative. And at this particular point, this was my fifth book of poems, I felt I had spoken of many things before, relationships and love and cities and gender politics and cultural history and all of that. None of that has gone away. It's just that I feel that as one inhabits oneself differently, as one grows older and maybe just a little wiser, one also learns to expand the gaze a little. And as the gaze expands and grows a little less needy and a little less clingy, there is an ability to look at the world with a little more affection, not deceived by the world and its promises, but with a little more affection and a little less neediness. And I think there is a greater willingness to inhabit the pause, which is really the province of poetry. So this is the pause between stories. This is the pause between narratives. This is the moment that we all need to reclaim in some way, I think, for ourselves. So there's a, I'm just going to quote, I'm sorry.
Story.
I'm sorry, because of the echo, I'm not sure I heard your question, but I just want to quote 4 lines from one of the poems there.
Please do.
It's a poet here who speaks, and her name is Avayar. She's a great Tamil poet, legendary, the stuff of myth almost. We don't know, there are many versions of Avayar. We don't know when she existed. All we know is that she was a very old, very wise woman. And she says, for lovers flatten into photographs, photographs into reminiscence, reminiscence into quiet. And then what's left? Perhaps just the oldest thing in the book, love without a story. That's where the title happens.
Lovely, lovely. So there is all that pause in between, perhaps the stories you tell through your poetry. So that brings us, from the material, the seen world, to the mystical, to the unseen world, which interests you as well. Tell us a little bit about your discoveries in the realm of the spiritual world.
Well, I've tried to document many of my discoveries in my books. So I think a deepening understanding of bhakti. We use the word bhakt today in so many unfortunate ways. And for me, it's so important to reclaim for myself the idea of bhakti not as spinelessness and obedience, but bhakti as a spirited relationship with the divine or with whatever, with the world, with life. That's what it was. That's how I read these poets, and that's how I hear these poets. For me, that was an important part of my spiritual journey. The fact that bhakti is not surrender to authority. Bhakti is surrender to love, which is different, a different kind of surrender. And the fact that poems, I realize more and more as I myself deepen the pause in my life, poems, I realize more and more, are the province of silences, where the silence is just as important as the word. And the more you respect the silence, the more you realize that the very octane of language is derived from silence, I think the more you allow those silences to riddle your poems, keeping the faith that they will be understood. So I think my poems have changed. The form has changed as a result of my own my own spiritual journey. And right now, I'd say there is a great desire for me as a spiritual traveler to hear the voices and reclaim the voices of women, because I feel we all collectively need to hear those voices. It's not women alone who need to hear women's voices. I've seen this thirst as much in men. There is a need we all have. It's a human need for a less lopsided, more inclusive spiritual inheritance.
Wonderful. So my last question to you, Arundhathi, is I'm very interested in your thoughts on how a poet contributes to making the world a little more comfortable, not just for a few people, but for a maximum number of human beings. This is not happening today, and therefore it's a question that is always, at the top of my mind. Tell me.
I wish I knew. I will say what has affected me as a reader and as a life traveler. I'm not always deeply impacted. I'm sometimes momentarily impacted by the raised voice. But the deepest and profoundest shifts in consciousness have happened to me not as a result of the raised voice. It has often happened to me as a result of the murmured voice. And that's how I define poetry. For me, it is the art of the murmur. It is the art of keeping the faith that when you drop your voice, you will still be heard. In fact, it is sometimes the more effective way to be heard in the din. And what a din it is, Mehru, right? Mm-hmm. What a clamor it is right now. Exactly. So I think we are all searching for strategies. My strategies are evolving as much as anyone else's. But I think for me, to see my art not as the language of the megaphone, but the language of the murmur, this has been important. And it's about deeply trusting that that can make a difference. Just like we trust that a flower that we might see today, or that ancient, unoriginal sunset that has happened one more time in our lives, can make a difference. I think one keeps the faith that the quiet voice, the voice that could be raised, but chooses not to, that can make the difference as well.
That is so beautiful. That was so beautiful. Thank you so much for talking to the citizen, and all the best, for the books that will be presented this year at the Jaipur Literature Festival, and for all the work that you still have to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Mehru. I enjoyed this conversation.